Hi, this is Coercive here. I'm on your side. So let me. I've sort of come to the end of this lecture series for the time being, and I just want to finish with this particular perspective, which is a question I've been listening to and asking myself for a long time. And I hope that this doesn't offer false hope, but it may offer a different perspective because of my multidisciplinary, abilities, I suppose, or learned abilities over many years. I can bring a lot of different perspectives to a question. So, can society change what psychology alone cannot? So, the subtitle of this is Narcissistic Abuse, Power, Consequences, and the Constitutional Blind Spot. So, I'm connected. I see them all as connected because of, that's, I suppose, the nature of the way I'm wired, I'm connected. Over the past number of years, I have read extensively about narcissism, narcissistic abuse, gaslighting, manipulation, coercive control, psychopathy, and what is sometimes described as the dark side. In particular, what is very, dark about the dark side is not just the Machiavellian side of it, but the sadism. That's horrific. So I've been, somebody would derive pleasure from the suffering of others. So I've also listened to many psychologists, psychiatrists, neuroscientists, researchers, and commentators trying to answer an extraordinarily difficult question. And this is, can people displaying severe and entrenched narcissistic inverted patterns, if I'm taking it now to the dark tetrad, which includes all of these, as a construct, includes all of these patterns of behaviour, actually change? And the answer from many psychologists appears to be deeply pessimistic, particularly when the individual does not recognize the problem, does not genuinely want to change, and continues to benefit from the behaviour. And this raises what I believe is a much larger question. Can psychology alone change behaviour that the rest of society continues to reward? I do not believe it can. If you just listen to the answers that all the psychologists give, it's consistent with this. So this is from the research. One psychologist working with one individual, I believe, from the research, does not seem to be able, or is saying that they cannot how could they counteract an entire reinforcement system outside the consulting room? So this is what I'm bringing to the perspective now. Therapy may help some people. Insight may help some people. Some people can learn, people can change. But imagine what happens when the person leaves the psychologist's office and discovers, the manipulation still works. The bullying still produces compliance. The gaslighting still transfers blame. The intimidation still silences the opposition. The way I've been intimidated over many, many years. My life has been destroyed by manipulation and all of these behaviours. Political manoeuvring still produces advancement. Well, there you go. That's a big question mark about that. And institutions still protect people who are sufficiently powerful, useful, or skilled at controlling the narrative. We won't mention any names in particular. Why should someone abandon behaviour that continually succeeds? This is the uncomfortable question. And this is why I increasingly believe we need to stop looking at narcissistic abuse solely as a psychological problem. It is also a problem of incentives, institutions, power, and consequences. I'm particularly interested in the dimensional approach discussed by Dr. Salerno recently. Rather than trying to diagnose everybody, we can examine patterns and degrees of behaviour. I like that. Of course, this is it's more a behavioural, view of these conditions, and I think that is more useful. That distinction is enormously important. I'm not suggesting that every bully, manipulator, or difficult person has a psychiatric disorder or condition, nor should members of the public attempt to diagnose people. Well, I'm just going to factor that out of it. The important question for society is much simpler. What is the behaviour? So focus on the behaviour, not the diagnosis. Forget about that. Is somebody repeatedly manipulating? Are they repeatedly gaslighting? Bullying, or is there a pattern of these behaviours recurring? Intimidating, deceiving. And you notice I'm not mentioning any physical harm here. Smearing another person, abusing institutional power, using procedure to avoid accountability. And if so, what happens next? Because if the answer is continually nothing, we have a very serious problem. The behaviour has effectively been rewarded. And this brings me to the central concept in this discussion: consequences. Not revenge, not humiliation, not punishment for punishment's sake, but genuine accountability. There eventually has to be a boundary, a point where society says enough is enough. No, you cannot intimidate everyone who challenges you. You cannot manipulate every process indefinitely. You cannot destroy another person's life or reputation because they raised legitimate concerns. You cannot continually transfer responsibility onto somebody else. You cannot use institutional power without limits. That's very important for the Supreme Court case. This is where the discussion moves beyond psychology. A psychologist cannot impose accountability on an institution. A psychologist cannot reform a corporation. A psychologist cannot reform a third-level institution or university. A psychologist cannot compel a public authority to investigate wrongdoing. A psychologist cannot require governments to respect constitutional limits, and a psychologist cannot determine whether constitutional structures actually work when they are put under pressure. These responsibilities belong to institutions, and ultimately in constitutional democracies they belong in part to the courts. This is why I have increasingly connected this wider question of power and accountability with the judicial review proceedings I brought arising from matters arising in the Irish presidential election 2025, which is last year. The constitutional questions that are now resting before the Supreme Court are, of course, legal questions. The court will determine the appropriate formulation and the legal answers. I have tried to reduce what I see as the central issues to a relatively small number of fundamental questions, principally about 4. But underlying these questions is something I have described in my research as the constitutional blind spot. And I believe the concept of time is central to understanding it. Constitutional law has historically normally asked, was something constitutional? Was a right infringed? Was a public authority acting within its powers? Was the democratic process operated according to the Constitution? But there is another question that constitutional law must increasingly confront. When must constitutional review occur for constitutional protection to be meaningful? Because a constitutional right examined too late may become, in practical terms, no right at all. Now, this I think, is very complementary to the work of the brilliant Anne Applebaum. My work and her work. This is a pure coincidence following, finding her brilliant interview there with Simon and Sonia in Australia recently. It was mind-blowingly brilliant. So imagine a democratic process that is allegedly interfered with. A citizen challenges that interference, but the democratic event proceeds, the deadline passes, the election takes place, and they were very, very good. I think it was Simon asked Anne Applebaum about elections. I mean, that was a brilliant question, absolutely brilliant. And the answer was equally brilliant. The election takes place, the results become final, and only afterwards does the legal question have sufficient time to determine whether what happened beforehand was constitutionally permissible. This creates what I called a constitutional blind spot. The alleged constitutional wrong may have existed, the constitutional question may be extremely important, but the system did not examine it before the event became irreversible. The issue is therefore not simply, was the Constitution breached? It is also, could the Constitution operate in time to prevent the consequences of a possible breach from becoming permanent? This is a very different question, and it introduces something that I believe constitutional law needs to take much more seriously: time as a constitutional variable. That's brilliant for a mathematician, would you not agree? Rights do not exist outside time. That's brilliant from a mathematical point of view. That's a brilliant insight, in my humble opinion. Elections do not exist outside time. Nomination processes do not exist outside time. Deadlines matter. Procedures matter, the sequence of decisions matter, and judicial remedies that arrive after an irreversible democratic event may be fundamentally different from remedies available beforehand. This is where my constitutional blind spot theory connects directly to the wider theme of this video and this, this whole YouTube channel, because systems of power can sometimes benefit from delay. If accountability arrives only after the consequences have become irreversible, then the practical lesson may be that the conduct succeeded. This is precisely the kind of incentive structure we should be examining, and I believe this may be one of the most important questions for the Irish Supreme Court. Not simply whether a constitutional question exists, but whether constitutional review must be capable of operating in time where an allegedly unconstitutional interference affects a time-sensitive democratic process. This could have implications extending far beyond one presidential election. It concerns how constitutional democracies protect themselves if something can happen quickly enough that the courts can never examine before it becomes final, that an extraordinary problem emerges. Are you getting it? Are you finally getting it after all my lectures? We may have constitutional rights in theory or on paper while developing zones in which rights cannot be protectively enforced. What's this called? Yes, you're absolutely right. It's called the constitutional blind spot. Very good, great, A++. And once such a blind spot is recognised, another question follows. What should courts do about it? Perhaps that's what I say to students when they answer, I go so far and then they fill in the blanks. Perhaps the answer is not always to reverse something. And the blanks, the way they fill them in mightn't be always the way I've expected. So it's nice to get different solutions. And then, you've really engaged the students when you get something that you're not expecting. Perhaps the answer, or even better than what you're expecting, then you realise, well, you've done a brilliant job. Perhaps the answer is not always to reverse something that has already become constitutionally final. That may be impossible, but courts can still clarify principles. They can identify constitutional boundaries. They can provide prospective guidance. I mean, that's all that's going to happen here. Prospective guidance. They can ensure that the same problem simply require, and I believe there is a duty to do that. I've introduced the concept of constitutional coherence, constitutional maintenance, and constitutional continuity, not to change the Constitution in order to ensure that the Constitution can maintain itself over time using these concepts. And they can recognise that constitutional protection must sometimes include procedures capable of responding to urgency. This is where I believe the connection with the psychology of power becomes particularly important. People learn from consequences. Institutions learn from consequences. Political systems learn from consequences. If questionable conduct succeeds because scrutiny always comes too late, that becomes an incentive. If manipulation works, it may be repeated. If obstruction works, it may be repeated. If delay defeats accountability, delay itself becomes strategically valuable. This is why I'm bringing time into constitutional law, and I believe this is why bringing time into constitutional law is so important. It must also contain or be interpreted through mechanisms capable of protecting those boundaries when it matters. Otherwise, the strongest constitutional protections can become retrospective observations about events nobody can no longer change. I mean, that is a failure of constitutional law if that happens, in my opinion, and I'm hoping that won't happen here. And that is not sufficient. The wider principle applies throughout institutional life. It applies when complaints are delayed until witnesses disappear. It applies when these are all these acts of omission. It applies when investigations continue until the relevant decision has already been made. It applies when somebody is excluded from a process and the appeal is determined only after the opportunity has disappeared. It applies when accountability is technically available but practically arrives too late. This is why timing itself can become part of justice, and sometimes timing can become part of injustice. This is the essence of the constitutional blind spot. It asks whether our systems recognise that delay can transform the constitutional position itself. I believe this is potentially one of the most significant issues emerging from my Supreme Court proceedings. My case cannot solve narcissistic abuse. A Supreme Court judgment cannot cure narcissism. It cannot eliminate manipulation. It cannot eliminate bullying. It cannot transform every dysfunctional organisation, but it can contribute to something enormously important. It can establish that power has limits. And perhaps most importantly, it can recognise that constitutional accountability must sometimes operate before time itself makes accountability ineffective. That principle could extend far beyond the facts of any individual case, because one of the central lessons from the study of narcissistic and manipulative behaviour is that boundaries matter, consequences matter, and environments matter. If manipulation continually succeeds, it is reinforced. If intimidation continually succeeds and is allowed to continue to succeed, and who allows all this behaviour to succeed? That's the question. If you go to certain institutions and say you were subjected to all these behaviours and they deny that this happened to you, they are actually reinforcing it. And why did they reinforce it? There's the question. And they'll cover up. But that's only an aside. And if institution system repeatedly fail to intervene when it's too late, that failure may itself become part of the problem. Sure, that's all what's going on right, left and centre. I'm not saying it's going on everywhere, but there's a huge amount of these going on, this sort of cover up, inverted commas, if you want to use a very mild word to describe what's going on. So perhaps closing the ranks. So perhaps we need to change the question. Instead of endlessly asking, how do we change the narcissist? We should ask, how do we change the system that rewards the behaviour?